A more long-lasting British attempt to break the trench stalemate was the tank. By mid-1916, armour, caterpillar tracks and the internal combustion engine had been brought together to form the first land ships capable of crossing trenches and supporting infantry. These were either the female, armed only with machine guns, or the male, with two 6-pounder guns in the side sponsons. These first tanks had a speed of about 4 miles an hour and a crew of 8. The British tanks were first used piecemeal in September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. They achieved some local successes. But it was not until the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, when 376 tanks were used, that their true potential was shown. Holes were punched in the German line, and by nightfall more than 5 miles had been gained. But the unreliability of these early tanks meant that the breakthrough could not be followed up. Nevertheless, the Germans were so impressed by the British successes that they urgently developed their own tank, a 33-ton monster with a crew of 18 named the A7V. Armed with a 57mm cannon and 6 machine guns, it was totally underpowered and unwieldy, and could only manage 3 miles an hour. But it was rushed into service to counter the British threat, and the first tank-against-tank confrontation soon followed. This came during the Great German Offensive in March 1918, when the storm troops tore through the British lines and penetrated more than 40 miles. A second assault in April kept up the momentum, and the possibility of breaking through to Paris suddenly seemed feasible. On the early morning of the 24th of April, Ludendorff's forward units were less than 10 miles from Amiens, probing towards the village of Villers-Bretonneux. 1.5 miles southwest of the village, a section of British tanks, 1 male and 2 females, was waiting in support of dug-in infantry. As the crews peered through the mist, they saw an extraordinary sight. One of the few operational German A7Vs lumbered into view. The British started up and moved forward to engage it. The world's first armored duel was underway. The ironclad monsters ponderously closed the range. Inside the tanks, the conditions were appalling. There was no proper suspension, and the unsilenced engines roared and belched fumes. Finally, the leading British tank, the male, opened fire with its 6-pounder gun, but missed. Unscathed, the A7V trundled on, its crew desperately trying to see where the fire was coming from. Finally, they spotted the enemy, halted, and opened fire. No effect at first, but then it began to find its range and struck both British females. Neither was disabled, but unable to make any impression with their machine guns, they halted and began to pull back. While the German was concentrating on its mates, the British male continued to advance and close the range. Its crew, desperately trying to hold the A7V in their sights as they were thrown around in the unsprung tank. At last they got within effective range and opened fire again. after a ranging shot, the A-7V was hit. Its crew decided that the British fire was getting a bit too accurate and began to withdraw, thus ending the world's first tank versus tank battle. The tank had revolutionized the battlefield, and the French were quick to see the need to add speed and mobility. They developed the 7-ton Renault FT-17 with a 2-man crew and a machine gun or 37mm cannon in the world's first traversing turret. The American forces, which had begun arriving in France in summer 1917, soon replaced their French helmets with the British version, but enthusiastically adopted the small French tank. They practiced with it before the cameras for publicity. Several hundred were brought forward in support when the Americans began their first major action as an independent force. This was September 1918 in the Meuse-Argonne area of northeastern France. There the Americans faced a daunting challenge. Their trenches lay at the foot of the slopes running up to the Argonne forest. They would have to attack uphill against an experienced enemy which had had plenty of time to build elaborate defensive positions. Behind the barbed wire and trenches of the German front line lay a series of machine gun nests which had been carefully camouflaged in the wooded terrain. German reinforcements could be rushed to these to blunt any breakthroughs. From them, the German defenders could bring withering fire to bear on advancing troops. The Americans had practiced hard using tanks to support their infantry, but these frequently came to grief, since the Renaults were only lightly armored and they could only get across a gap of 6 feet. Despite these problems, the US troops were able to break through after 3 weeks' savage fighting and force the Germans to abandon their defensive line.